The days before New Year are always strange. During the day, everything looks normal. People, stores, noise. But at night, the city feels like it dies out, especially if you don't live downtown. That year, I was working remotely and taking night shifts on the side, monitoring servers for a small company. The job was simple: sit at home, watch the screens, respond if something went down. Most nights it meant staying awake until morning, staring at a monitor. On December 31st, I was alone. My friends had left town. My family was in another city. It didn't bother me. I actually liked it. A quiet night, some work, then sleep. I live on the second floor of an old building. My windows face the courtyard. It's small and enclosed. A rundown playground and a couple of trees. In winter, almost no one goes there. By midnight, everything had gone quiet. Fireworks could be heard somewhere far away, but here, silence. I was sitting at my desk, the glow from the monitor lighting up the room. I'd turned on a string of lights just for the mood. They were hanging along the curtain rod, reflecting faintly in the glass. At 1:40 a.m., I got up to make some tea and instinctively looked out the window. That's when I noticed the streetlight was off. It was always on. I couldn't remember a single time it had been turned off. Without it, the courtyard looked unnaturally dark, like it had collapsed inward. I stood by the window for a few seconds, then went back to my desk. At 1:57, I got a notification. The server lost connection for a second. Nothing serious, but I frowned. That rarely happened. I looked out the window again and saw that someone was there. At first, I thought it was a shadow or light from the decorations reflecting strangely, but no. Between the trees stood a person, almost directly under my window, slightly off to the side, right where the streetlight used to shine. He wasn't moving. He was wearing a dark jacket and a hat. I couldn't see his face. He stood with his back to the entrance, and his face toward the building, toward my building. I felt a brief irritation. I assumed it was just someone drunk after the holiday. That happens. But something didn't feel right. He stood too still, didn't sway, didn't smoke, didn't check his phone. He just stood there. I stepped away from the window, sat back down, and decided not to overthink it. But a couple of minutes later, I caught myself looking again. He was still there. And now, he was closer, not suddenly. Not enough for me to say he had walked forward, just the distance had shortened, as if I'd misjudged it before. But I knew I hadn't. I closed the curtains. The room immediately felt safer. I sat down, took a sip of tea, and tried to focus on work. The server was fine. The building was quiet. Maybe 10 minutes passed. Then I heard a sound. Not footsteps, not a voice. A faint, barely noticeable scraping sound, like something rubbing against concrete. I stood up and walked to the window. My heart was beating just a little faster than it should have. Carefully, I moved the curtain aside. The man was standing directly under my window. He was looking up. Now I could see his face, or at least the lower part of it. A scarf covered his mouth and nose. His eyes were hidden in shadow, but I knew he was looking at me, not just upward, into my room. I stepped back. A stupid thought crossed my mind. He doesn't know I'm here. But the glow from the monitor said otherwise. He definitely knew. I turned off the string lights, then the monitor. The room fell into darkness. I stood there, not breathing. The scraping sound came again. I realized it was the sound of a boot, slowly sliding along the curb beneath my window. He wasn't leaving. I pulled out my phone and checked the time. 2:14 a.m. I I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? There's a man standing under my window? Technically, he wasn't doing anything. I risked another look. His face was closer to the glass, not physically. He couldn't reach it, but he tilted his head back further. I saw his eyes. They weren't darting around. They weren't blinking. He was just watching. Then he slowly raised his hand. Not to wave, not to knock. He placed his palm against the wall of the building, directly beneath my window. I stepped back, tripped over a chair, almost fell. My heart was pounding in my throat. I pressed myself against the opposite wall and waited. After about a minute, everything went quiet. I approached the window again. The courtyard was empty. The streetlight was still off. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I went outside. There were no footprints in the snow, not a single one. The snow was smooth, untouched. The streetlight was on again. I almost convinced myself it had just been a strange person, just a coincidence, just a night. Until the evening of January 1st, when I turned on my computer. There was a notification on the screen. System login, 2:14 a.m. I checked the logs. That login wasn't mine. I reread the notification several times before I understood what I was seeing. System login, 2:14 a.m. The IP address was unfamiliar, not mine, not my home network, not one I had ever used. At first I thought it was an error. Servers glitch sometimes, especially during holidays. But deep down, I had a bad feeling, like something had lined up too perfectly. 2:14, the time he stood beneath my window, the time I checked my phone. I opened the logs in more detail. The login was brief, no actions, just a connection and disconnect, as if someone had checked they could get in and left. I closed the laptop. The room was quiet, but now the silence felt different. I realized I was standing in the middle of the room, listening, even though nothing was happening. The rest of the day felt off. I went grocery shopping, greeted neighbors, even smiled. But I kept catching myself looking toward the courtyard. The streetlight was on. Everything looked normal. That evening I decided I had just been stressed. New Year's, night, being alone. It happens. I went to bed around midnight. I woke up suddenly, not from a sound, but from the same feeling as the night before, like someone had come too close. I didn't check my phone right away. I didn't want to. First, I looked at the window. The curtains were closed, but through the fabric I could see a faint flicker of light. I hadn't turned the lights on. I was sure of it. I sat up in bed. The flickering repeated at a steady rhythm, too steady to be a random reflection. I stood up and moved closer. The string lights were on. Not just on, they were set to a different mode, a slow blinking pattern I had never used. I reached out and unplugged them. The room went dark again. I checked my phone. 2:14 a.m. That's when I felt real fear. I stood still, listening. From below, from the courtyard, came a faint sound. Not footsteps, not voices. The same scraping sound as the night before. I walked to the window and slowly moved the curtain aside. The man was there again, in the same place, in the same position, as if he had returned to where he'd left. I already knew what not to do. Don't turn on the lights. Don't open the window. Don't let him know I see him. I stood in the darkness, barely breathing. But he knew. He slowly lifted his head. Even without the light, I felt his gaze. It wasn't a feeling. It was certainty. Like knowledge that didn't need proof. He took a step forward, then another. I realized he was approaching the building. Too close. I could no longer see his whole body, only the top of his head as he tilted his face upward. The scraping grew louder. I understood then. He was looking for a place he could reach. I backed away slowly, almost by touch, trying not to make a sound. There was only one thought in my head. If he knocks, I won't open. I didn't know why, but I was sure if I did, it would be a mistake. A minute passed, maybe two. The sound stopped. I approached the window again. The courtyard was empty. But now, on the wall of the building, directly beneath my window, I saw marks in the plaster, dirty streaks, like from fingers or a palm. I pulled the curtain shut and stepped away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I called the building management, asked about the street light. They told me it was working fine. No outages reported. As for the marks on the wall, they said they'd take a look. When I went outside later that day, the marks were gone, as if they had never existed. I started checking the doors, the locks, the windows. I caught myself listening for footsteps in the stairwell. Every sound suddenly mattered. On the evening of January the 2nd, I turned on my laptop again. This time, I was waiting, and at 2:14 I received another notification. Login attempt. The password was entered incorrectly. Once, then again, then a third time. I stared at the screen as my hands went cold. This wasn't brute force. This was a test. I shut the laptop and stood up. From the street below came a familiar sound. Scraping. I didn't go to the window. I already knew what I would see. On the third day, I left. Packed my things, called a friend, stayed over at his place. I slept peacefully there. No dreams, no sudden awakenings. A week later, I came back. Everything looked normal in the courtyard. The streetlight was on. The snow lay smooth and untouched. I almost believed it was over. Until a few days later, when I received an email from the company. The subject line read, "Security Update." Inside was a list of recent logins. One of them had been made from my home at 2:14 a.m. That night, I wasn't there.